Hi everyone, so last night we had a Season 9 campfire chat and the final patch notes for the season start on 1st of July, which is next Tuesday. There's a lot of stuff to go through, a lot of class updates have happened that actually really shake things up, a bunch of surprises, and I want to try to keep it as concise as possible. I've prepared my notes here from yesterday, I just revised this a little bit as well, consolidated this, and I want to give you the best picture that I can give right now. Now do keep in mind that we still have a lot of cooking to do when it comes to updating the builds. Our Maxwell guys, for example, are hard at work right now trying to update their builds, update the guides that we're gonna have here on Maxwell, including the tier list that is going to be updated during this weekend. So stay tuned for that. And I don't have the 100% perfect picture of every single build out there because, well, we have a lot of them. So just keep that in mind, but I'll try to give the best overview that I can. Now let's jump in. A lot of balance changes have happened that actually really shake up what we thought would be the meta in Season 9. Most importantly, there are a lot of nerfs out there when it comes to like some of the classes and some of the build archetypes. So for example, Overpower has been effectively gutted. So builds that are not overpower builds by design, like Polarize or some of the Barbs stuff or something like that, will probably not really go for overpower through, for example, Xanrune anymore. The reason for that is that they have completely removed the additive damage scaling of it, which was somewhere in a range of times 3, 4, maybe 5 or so DPS when it comes to overpowering, depending on how much life and fortified life you had. Now there is another advantage here, which is that overpower builds do not require to run Fortify anymore, so that makes getting that online a little bit easier. But the overall effect is that all overpower builds are going way down. This was already visible on the PTR, but now they have doubled down on that and they removed all the additive scaling. So no more stack life to get more damage, which is probably a pretty healthy change for the long-term perspective of the game, I gotta say. So I think that was kind of important to do at some point, and now they have done it. And well, it's gonna kind of like throw some stuff out of whack for now. In particular, Barbs and Druids get hit a lot by this, but Overpower was kind of creeping into all of the classes, like even Sorcs that have no business overpowering anything. Were using that basically, and we had stuff like the Death Trap Rogue and a bunch of other stuff all over the place that was overpowering through, for example, the Xanrune, and that is maybe still happening, but it's not really going to be like a massive upgrade over other choices at least. So what this means in practice is that basically all of the classes that really rely on overpower, which is almost everything on Druid and a lot of stuff on Barb, is much weaker than in the past. And on top of this, they had some targeted nerfs. For example, Barbs, Earthquakes got mega nerfed, and a bunch of other stuff in that category that just kind of bring down a lot of builds in general, especially some of the top tier builds. The only kind of like lone survivor up here is the Spiritborn. Spiritborn was the strongest on the PTR, outside of like some bug shatter stuff on the Sorc basically, which is gone as well. And yeah, they did nerf it a little bit, but probably not really enough to really close the gap to other classes. But that being said, Spiritborn is like both somewhat like hard to build and hard to play, I would say, because it's also very squishy. So especially when you go to like pit 110, 120 plus or so, stuff really wrecks you. So this is something to keep in mind. So Spiritborn has it all kind of with like the best pushing builds, and there's multiple of those that are at the top here. Then we also have Evade, for example, that is looking really good, and it's going to be, for example, my starter that will just fly through the Torment difficulties, go to Torment 4, be like one of the best Paragon farmers, and so on. So Spiritborn has like the speed farming down, it has the pushing, but it is also still the Spiritborn being like kind of like a squishy class. You have to like, get the right timing on your abilities and these kind of things, so keep that in mind. But yeah, overall, it's kind of a Spiritborn season, I would say. That being said though, Hydra is a thing. So Hydra has gotten a massive update through one of the new uniques, and it is looking like one of the best builds out there, even with some of the changes that we have seen in the final patch notes. I expect this to be somewhere in the top 5 at least out of all builds, and definitely the best on the Sorc. So I expect a lot of people to go for this. That seems to be like some pretty chill, comfy, just kind of like teleport, cast a Hydra kind of playstyle, reminiscent of like Typhon Wizard in Diablo 3, for example. So I'm definitely excited to see that, and I think a lot of people are looking forward to this. There are some other builds out there. There is, for example, Meteor, Chain Lightning, something like Ice Shards as well. So there's other options. Even a Lightning Spear that got pretty gutted. I think we're gonna see that at least for like Torment 4 farming or so. But yeah, overall Sorc is looking kind of solid, I would say. Then we have the Necro. I'm not 100% sure about everything here. We had the overpower nerfs, which will affect a lot of these builds, like this and this, for example. And I know that Bone Spear is kind of gutted, but there were some other bone buffs, so this might affect Bone Spirit a little bit. So that might be pretty decent still. Blood Wave, we got a bit of a target nerf, but not much. So I expect that to be pretty good. But mostly the minions I expect to be kind of like a popular choice here on the Necro. They have the new unique for the skeletal mages. And this also got buffed, and it was already pretty strong on the PTR. So overall, I expect minions to be like kind of like the main build here when it comes to Season 9. But there are a bunch of good options. Necro remains pretty powerful across the board, I would say. Then we have the rogues. So Death Trap was the undisputed king for 3 seasons now, and it has finally gotten enough nerfs to not be just like #1 by design, and there are other options now. And in general, actually, it looks pretty like a good variety on the rogue here. So we have TB coming back either with Poison TB or with Azure Wrath. There's also Azure Wrath Penshot, there's also Azure Wrath Barrage. So you can actually play a lot of different core skills as long as you scale into the proc stuff. As Rain of Arrows that's out there. Death Trap is still really good, and I would still really recommend to go for that if you want to have an easy time. But we have a bunch of other builds here on the rogue, so it's looking kind of nice. Shadow Clone got nerfed a little bit. I'm going to go through some of those class changes as well in more detail in a moment, but this is kind of what we got. Then we have the Druids. I did talk about the overpower nerfs, and that affects almost every build. There is like the old school so-called Singer Druid with Flash Render, but this is actually played with Bulwark now, I think. Either way, on the PTR, that was the strongest build, and I think it will remain so. Companions also kind of just dodged most of the nerfs, so I expect those to be relatively strong, but they're kind of clunky, I feel, especially when it comes to farming. Pulse, I'm not really sure, depends a little bit on the updates and how they work exactly for the new weapon, but the new unique weapon for the Pulverize did get some insane buffs, actually. In fact, they kind of like one-to-one copied my suggestions and put them into the game. So personally, I'm looking forward to that at least, and I will actually make a Druid probably as my second class, just to play Pulv after I probably start with Spiritborn here. But yeah, overall Druid is looking a bit on the weak side, and it does have like 1 or 2 like kind of like pretty decent builds, a bit of a question mark here, and we'll see. And then comes the Barb. Well, Barbs lost a lot here. The overpower stuff is important, and Earthquakes got target nerfed pretty heavily, and yeah, the minion Barb might just be completely gone now. So overall, Barbs are kind of in despair mode. They have like kind of like solid, fast, like T4 farming builds and so on, but they're definitely like overall the weakest. I think they will not have a single build that will get close to the actual push builds that some of the other classes have, but I guess we'll see. Now, with all that being said, even though we have a lot of nerfs, they have also rescaled the pit again, starting from Torment 1, and they said this makes it easier to go to Torment 4. I'm not sure if the easier scaling will stop at Torment 4, if that will continue beyond Torment 4, but either way, accumulated through dozens of pit tiers, even like a small change, like a 1 or 2% change in the HP scaling can make a pretty massive difference. So it is actually not unlikely that despite all of these crazy nerfs, we will reach higher tiers than in the last season. At the very least, on some of these stronger builds out there, maybe some that got really heavily nerfed might end up somewhere similar or maybe a bit lower, but overall I expect that that is largely going to mitigate most of those nerfs, and they're just trying to like kind of balance out the game as a whole a bit better, which I think is not a bad idea. Now let's talk about some of the other overall game updates. We have the Nightmare Dungeon Escalation. So this is like one of the big new features. I have revamped Nightmare Dungeons. There's lots of new affixes, more rewarding affixes, more dangerous affixes, and this escalation system where you have like a series of 3 dungeons in a row that scale up now. So this was like one of the main complaints, that it was just like Torment 4 difficulty. It doesn't really feel like an escalation, like something is like really getting harder or so. So they have actually done that with several pit tiers per floor scaling. So I'm not sure what that exactly that will mean, but I expect somewhere in the range of like a ×2, ×3 or so in terms of, for example, monster HP per floor. So you're gonna actually feel that quite a lot, and especially towards the Astaroth fight, which is on the 4th floor, which may get this pit tier buff again. That's probably gonna be like a pretty like tough and like long fight or so, unless you have like giga damage. So that's kind of what I expect. which sounds like this feature is going to be a lot more fun than what we have seen on the PTR, where it was just kind of boring. So I'm kind of excited for that. I think this is looking really good and really fun, and Nightmare Dungeons might actually be a real, valuable activity to farm, and it will feel rewarding for doing something more challenging and kind of like juicing it, quote unquote, I guess, with those escalation sigils. So kind of excited for that, and we have something new to do, a bit more variety in the gameplay, instead of just like, bosses, pit, and that's it. Now we have that as well. Then we have the strong rooms. So this is part of the Nightmare Dungeon rework. So there are these like side dungeons, basically. This is kind of like the first special activity they put into Nightmare Dungeons, which is hopefully also signs of things to come for the future, where we hopefully get more stuff like that. But we have this now, so it's basically like a 100-second little event where you go in. There's like bunch of these like pillars. You like fight monsters there, and then you get a buff, and then you try to go through it as fast as possible, and you get a bunch of juice at the end, like lots of rewards basically. The faster you go and the more you do. There's new bosses in there, so we'll see how this will go, but especially if they're like also like, bumped up from like the escalation, extra pit tiers and so on, that could be pretty fun, I think. And this is also where you get those sigils for the most part, so you can't craft them. So yeah, overall, Nightmare Dungeons is looking like a really kind of like core activity now, where previously I guess most people had been kind of leaving them on the side and ignoring them for the most part. And I expect you're gonna spend a lot of time here, but it will also come down a little bit to how many boss battles can you get there, and also how much XP can you get there, because this is kind of like a pretty deciding factor, I'd say, when it comes to like especially late game grinding. But at the very least, they're going to be good for getting all kinds of materials. Yeah, some other like miscellaneous updates here. So we had the experience orbs as well. They mentioned those. So this was going to be probably the best 1 to 60 strategy, where you go for these Nightmare Dungeon sigils that have these experience orbs. They were like fixed scaling, like you can go on normal difficulty, and even at low level you get like insane amounts of XP. So you could actually get to 60 really fast. So they said that they will scale better and more consistently. So I assume that they're going to be worse now on low level, but maybe better later on. But I have no idea what exactly this will mean. So we're probably going to try out the Nightmare Dungeon leveling strat anyway, see how this will go. It could still be pretty good, but maybe not. And otherwise, maybe Nightmare Dungeons are actually a bit of an alternative to pit grinding when it comes to XP later on. Because, now that they scale, maybe actually get enough XP from those things. Some other important updates here. Belial mats drop a lot more, especially with the Season Blessing dropping out in Season 9. This was previously buffed by 80%. Now it's not buffed, but now it just scales up with Torment. So you might actually get more Belial mats than before. So this is really good. Belial is really good and really important to actually get the uniques that you're looking for. And we got like a very few of that back in Season 8. Then we have Pengor's update, works with crit and overpower now. I know there are a lot of other problems with this item, but it might be good enough now to be used in many of the basic skill builds, and this is kind of like a basic skills season. They have buffed a lot of stuff here. They made a new unique for the Barbs, for example. There's like Earth Spike on the Druid. There's a bunch of stuff on the Rogue and so on. So basic skills are kind of all over the place, and I expect Pengors to kind of go into most of those builds now. Now let's talk about some of the class changes. I have mentioned a few already up there in the ranking, but yeah, Barbarians, it's really not looking good. So there is a lot of nerfs across the board. So heavy hitter temper is gone, which is probably a good thing, because it had this crazy double dipping with the minion barb. It also was kind of like, a huge swing in power if you managed to get those masterwork crits on the heavy hitter like 3 times on every single weapon. Like that was kind of ridiculously hard to do. And yeah, it's probably for the better, but it also means that Barbarians are just kind of weak right now, because there was not really a lot of compensation for this stuff. They also nerfed heavy hitter on top of that. They nerfed Ugly Bastard Helm, they nerfed Earthquakes on top of that. So yeah, overall, it's just kind of like looking rough out there when it comes to the Barbs. So this is like what we have here. You can see some of these changes here. There's a few other things in there, like a random Dust Devil nerf for no reason whatsoever. But it looks like they're kind of like setting Barb up to be like, more balanced in the future. And I also expect that, for example, in maybe the following season, or maybe later, maybe they're going to do like a patch and like, bring some stuff up a little bit across the board for the Barbs during Season 9, just to like make people enjoy the class a bit more. But yeah, for now, it's looking rough. Then we have the Druids here. So Druids, also, as I mentioned earlier, they suffered a lot from all the overpower nerfs. Basically, every build was an overpower build, pretty much. And that will be felt. That being said, though, they do have like this big Pulve update, so I think that's going to be pretty exciting. This new weapon is a powerhouse, I think, from what it looks like. and it's gonna make Pulve pretty fun and solid enough, I would say. There's also a Pulve size temper now, so you can actually hit like the entire screen. So I think that is all gonna feel pretty good, even if it's not like the strongest build out there. But at least it gets me excited to play some Druid. But there's also a bunch of other buffs across the board here, and also a bunch of kind of like, yeah, nice little fixes to some of the core issues that the class had. So for example, these are now utility aspects instead of offensive, so you can do the Dire Wolf, Greasy Rage stuff much more easily. And you have this here, which didn't really offer much of like a damage benefit by itself. So this is kind of making sense now, I'd say. Earthspike got a nice buff. They fixed Rabid Bear aspect, which was broken on the PTR, so this is now usable. This is also going to help a lot of builds. Agile Wolf is finally fixed for the Shred builds. So yeah, overall, I think the changes to Druids are really good. I think they mostly did like the right stuff in the right places. But again, Druids will remain a bit on the weaker side of classes right now. So I guess we'll see how this will play out exactly. But this is what we got here. Then we have the Necromancer. So Necromancer, I am not 100% sure about everything. But overall, I can say the minions is going to be very strong. Bloodwave probably still remains pretty strong. Bone Spear seems pretty dead. And well, there's a bunch of other little changes, like Affliction could be like a thing now. I know people were trying to make like a build around this, where you just like spam your curses and stuff, and this now gives you like much more damage. The proc has been updated a lot, so that does like a lot of more damage now. This is here. And maybe this is going to be like kind of like a curse, like or Affliction proc build now or something like that. So this could be a thing. But overall, I think Necros are looking like solid enough. There is a bunch of variety when it comes to the different like top tier options, I'd say. And well, Necros remain Necros basically. So they're not really the fastest, but usually pretty strong. And it seems like this kind of like carries forward here in Season 9 as well. Then we have the Rogues. So Rogues actually got a bunch of updates here. So first of all, Deathtrap is not the undisputed king anymore. There are other options. So they have nerfed the Deathtrap sufficiently. Let's say there was like a targeted damage nerf, but they did buff back the Eyes in the Dark a little bit. So we're probably gonna keep using that now. Where previously on the PTR, we didn't actually use the unique for Deathtrap designed for the build because it was so weak. So they fixed that, and Eyes in the Dark goes back in. And well, there's some other changes, like Shadow Clown is now minus 50% damage, so it's not going to be like carrying you by itself in all builds anymore, but it also means it's mostly a close to 50% damage reduction for most builds out there, because everything that was not Death Trap or Rain of Arrows basically used Shadow Clown, and mostly was carried by the damage of the Shadow Clown, while the Rogue itself didn't really do anything. So that will probably remain kind of like noticeable with like how much damage the clone does compared to you, but it might also open up some other choices now where I can kind of scale your damage while also scaling the clone damage, and it will kind of even out. We'll see exactly where this will land, but at the very least there's going to be less reliance on the clones, which means that we don't have to deal that much with the bad AI that it has. But they did not fix that in any way. So Shadow Clone will probably still make its way into many builds and will still feel mildly frustrating when the clone doesn't do what it's supposed to do. But yeah, that being said, it does offer a lot of variety of builds. So there is Death Trap, there is TB, there is another version of TB, there's Penshot, there's Poison Trap, there's Rain of Arrows. So overall, it's looking pretty good on the rogue side when it comes to the variety. And most of the stuff is solidly strong at least. So I do expect like, in the range of like Pit 90, 100, for most of these builds that I just mentioned, and this is with the old pit scaling, and they made pit scaling easier. So yeah, overall it's looking pretty good, and a bunch of kind of like issues were addressed pretty nicely here. On top of this, we have the Victimize change. So now Victimize is actually a passive again. So mostly it will be used for a flat like 75% damage increase when you proc it. So this will be really good for ranged builds that don't want to run precision. Basically, for example, Heartseeker, like ranged basic builds especially, so you don't have to like proc close quarters all the time and like shadow step in and then get the buff or something like that. For example, something like Penshot might also want to run that. So we'll see where this will land, but it is definitely a good update here, and I'm excited to try this out. They also made it so that overall the key passes are just more consistent, easy to cap out close quarters and precision, for example. A chemical admixture doesn't have any scaling anymore, but it has just like flat, really good buffs as well for especially poison builds. Maybe something like a Shadow Imbue build could also be a thing. but we'll see. And yeah, overall, I think they have done relatively good stuff here on the Rogue. Then you have the Sorc changes. So I talked about some of those. Hydra is the king, especially burn Hydra is the way. So there was kind of an option to play crit, but that is now completely gone, I would say. So burn Hydra it is. And well, Lightning Spear remains relatively dead. So there was a heavy nerf to that in the PTR that was not really addressed again. I do expect it's still gonna kind of pop off at some point when you have really good gear, and it's gonna be like the best T4 build out there anyway, at least on the very high end, but it will probably take a while to get to that point. So that's kind of like my expectation, because it didn't actually really nerf its functionality, they only nerfed its damage quite heavily, but 44 you might have enough at some point anyway. Yeah, then we have the Hydra enchant. So that was something that you couldn't really use on the PTR, and maybe now it can be used. But the problem is that Hydra enchant procs the Hydra after spending a lot of mana, and they reworked the Serpentine aspect to give you the damage bonus based on how much mana you have in that moment. So depending on the order of operations, that might work or that might not work with the Hydra enchant, where you cast Hydra, you spend a lot of mana, and then maybe the Hydra enchant Hydra is buffed, or maybe not. So we'll see, but I guess the intention here is that this works with the Hydra enchant, because this is actually literally what they said here in the developer note about this point. So we'll see, and I expect that this will actually function properly, and Hydra enchant is going to be a thing. So this will definitely buff Hydra quite a bit, even though they did a bit of a number tweaking here. But again, this is a bit of a question mark. Some other nice little changes. So Flame Shield like lost its bugs, so that's well, technically a nerf to the Sorc, but it's good that the bugs are fixed, I think, because you kind of had to like shoehorn in Flame Shield and impress it in the right moment when you didn't really want to, basically, most of the time. So that was good, I think. Shivering Ice Armor can now proc multiple times at once, which is important, especially for the Hydra build. So you have like easy perma Ice Armor. It's gonna feel really good to play Hydra. So that's for sure. And last but not least, we have the Spiritborn changes here. So we have the new Balazan pants. It's like a poison thorns build, and there is actually 3 really good variants of that all have pretty comparable performance. So there's one with Quill, one with Rake, and one with Thrash. And all of these will be like probably by far the strongest out of all of the builds out there, basically, when it comes to pit pushing. But these are mostly pit pushing like designed builds. They are, for example, not as good in like Torment 4 farming and so on. You can still use that, of course, and you can still do the bosses and so on, and you're gonna have a pretty easy time, but there are better builds out there. So overall, Spiritborn, strongest pusher, the way it looks like. They did not fix the Jaguar Hall double dipping. There's a bunch of stuff that you can double dip on, especially the Mystic Circles, which makes, some of this like, farming a little bit more clunky if you're trying to use the Mystic Circles in Torment 4 content, for example. They have a long cooldown. They're not really, very consistent. But for pushing, this is not a problem. So you have like a pretty huge gap on the Spiritborn when it comes to the power and the damage output in a push scenario versus a farming scenario, especially thanks to Jaguar Hall and the double dipping. So this was not changed, which is probably good for now, because they didn't really buff a lot of other stuff in a meaningful way. So there would have been the option to maybe fix the double dipping, but then buff a lot of stuff like Kepeleke and Zapasontek and whatever to kind of like make up for that. But instead they chose to not do any of those changes, because it was probably also relatively risky, and Spiritborn would have likely ended up in kind of like, bottom of the whole list, basically. So they decided to kind of keep it as it is and do some other like small things here. Most of these are not really that impactful, but the Hunter is nerfed a bit. Balazan pants are also nerfed by 50%, so they did bring down these top tier Spiritborn builds a little bit. Overall, I think you're gonna see a reduction of something like 5 pit tiers here. So it's not gonna be like Spiritborn is like ridiculously ahead of everything, but I think it's gonna be visible at least. Then we have a bunch of buffs to some of the ultimates. Some of them seem relatively useless, like Devourer, and Protector is maybe a thing if you can keep it up all the time and you really want the defense and the barriers, for example. So this could be interesting, but for the most part, I think Hunter remains kind of like the meta choice. in most cases, because it still has like a lot of good utility, a lot of damage buffs and so on, even with the nerfs. Seeker could be something that we might see a little bit more often when you can spam it enough. So this might be something for evade push build that actually use that, and maybe some other stuff like Razor Wings or Touch of Death or so, builds that don't hit 100% crit very easily, for example. So maybe gonna see a bit of variety there. And finally, the update to Razor Wings. So I don't expect her to be like a very good build, but it might be, let's say, a playable build out there, and it might also be like an actual ranged playstyle. So I will definitely try to do something there after I've done my initial like Spiritborn blasting. You know, I'm probably gonna start with evade and then do a bit of pushing, and then we might try this at some point, and I'm excited to see what we can do with Razor Wings. And that also wraps up the patch notes summary here. So overall, I have to say most of the changes are good and kind of like needed, or like, you know, they're kind of like moving us in the right direction. I really like the updates to the Nightmare Dungeon system. I think that's going to be pretty fun and pretty exciting to explore. There's probably going to be like lots of strategies around that as well, with like which materials you can farm the best way possible and so on. So that's going to be fun. It does seem like we have a decent meta shakeup as well, with like all the classes having like new builds at the top, which was kind of a problem in Season 8, which had plus minus exactly the same builds, just weaker from Season 7, for example. So we do have some nice changes here, and I'm excited to jump in on all of the classes and, you know, try some of the stuff. Even on the weaker classes like the Barbs and the Druids, I think it's going to be pretty fun to explore the new options here. I had a ton of fun with both of these on the PTR anyway. As always, I will be keeping you guys updated with, you know, build guides, some other stuff that I find out and so on once the season goes live, of course. And also stay tuned for the Maxwell updates. So we are hard at work here. We have a lot of guys currently like writing the updated guides, and there's a lot of work to do. And as the, you know, days leading up to launch like progress, we will have more of these guides updated, and the plan is we have everything ready for Season 9. We will have the tier list also sometime during this weekend, and you can go check out everything here on Maxwell once this is done. So for now, this is what I got to share here. Hope you enjoyed this. Let me know your thoughts, maybe some stuff I missed. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff in those patch notes, and yeah, we'll see what happens. So hope you liked this, and see you guys next time.